Just as God relayed in the Holy Scriptures through his prophets, the descendants of Israel, who became the most powerful nations on earth in fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they have, just as he said, become spiritually sick and morally degenerate from head to toe, as Isaiah tells us. After becoming recipients of the massive number of blessings contained in that promise that was made to the patriarchs, which included, remember, control of the gates of your enemies, they made the grievous error of forgetting that God is the source of the greatness that they possess. They have taken to themselves the prerogatives of God, going so far now in our day and time as to declare that gender, which are dozens and dozens according to them, can only be determined by them. Despite the gender that God determined, the two genders, by the miraculous process of conception and birth. God determined that. He established that, not man, but they think that they can take that to themselves. They've ignored and even ridiculed the warnings that God prophesied specifically for them. Back in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 8, after God goes through and tells Israel how he humbled them in the wilderness and provided for them and all, he gives a warning beginning here in verse 11. He says, "Beware that you do not forget the eternal your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest, if you do that, if you forget, if you don't do it, when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply and your silver and your gold are multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up and you forget the eternal your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, and for those today who gave you the promises, the blessings contained within the promises made to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who led you, verse 15, through the great and terrible wilderness in which were fiery serpents, or poisonous snakes is what it means, and scorpions, and thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you, and that he might test you, to do you good in the end. Then you say in your heart," after going through all of this experience, "My power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth." Now this warning is universal. It applies to all of those who have descended from those who entered into covenant with God at Mount Sinai, and to all who have entered into the new covenant with God after having repented of their sins and being baptized. Remembering the eternal God and obeying him by keeping his commandments is an absolute requirement for those who desire to receive his promised gift of eternal life. Even though true of all 10 commandments, there is one of the commandments, back here in Exodus chapter 20, there is one of the commandments that God directly specifies must be remembered. They all have to be, but this one he specifies. Here in verse 8 of Exodus 20, remember what? The Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day. God told them to remember specifically because they had only been introduced to the Sabbath 2 weeks previously. In fact, they had just kept their second weekly Sabbath the day before he gave the 10 Commandments. So remember it. Don't forget it. Now he goes on here in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. To keep it holy. This is why you need to keep this fourth commandment in mind. Now, to be holy means to be set apart for a specific purpose by the Almighty God. Very few of God's people have any difficulty in remembering which day of the week the Sabbath was created. We all know it's the seventh day. It's very clear. They remember that it's the final day of the week, God's people do. The difficulty they sometimes experience is in remembering to keep that day holy. To keep it holy. To make that the most thing that's the most poignant in mind on that day. Keeping it holy and staying alert to not misuse the holy time. This difficulty seems to have increased as the speed of the moral collapse of the world continues to intensify around God's people today. Since that is the case, today I would like to, as a reminder to the people of God, review the institution of and the purpose for the Sabbath day. So, let's go over to the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. Where God lays out all of his appointed times, which is what the word means. It talks about festivals. It's appointed times. There are appointed times of the eternal. In verse 1, Leviticus 23, and the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feast, the appointed times of the eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations or assemblies. These are my feasts. These are my appointed times. 6 days. Notice what the first one is. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh is a Sabbath of solemn, or as some other translations, of complete rest. A holy convocation, assembly, as a number of translations bring out. It is a day of rest, a time of assembly. You shall do no work on it. Notice that. No work. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the eternal in all your dwellings. It's not the Sabbath of the Jews. It's not the Sabbaths of Israel. It's the Sabbaths of the eternal that he told those people to keep. In fact, he told all of mankind to keep it. But specifically, he told Israel. Preceding the rest of the seventh day are 6 days when work is to be done. Labor is to be carried out by man in order to provide for his physical needs. Now, during those 6 days, man is given a lot of latitude in making personal choices and in fulfilling his desires. You know, God doesn't put a whole lot of restrictions, just keep the commandments all the time, but there's not a lot of restrictions as far as what you want to do on those 6 days. However, that all changes with the arrival of the seventh day of the week. Man must then rest. That's what God says. Rest from what he has done the previous 6 days in providing for his physical needs. And man is required. That's required, not suggested, required to attend a holy assembly, holy convocation, sacred assembly. That's what it says. You know, we just read it right here. The word holy is from the Hebrew word kodesh or kodash, whichever pronunciation you like best, which means set apart for a godly or special purpose. Set apart for a godly or special purpose. The assembly itself is holy because it is commanded by God. He is the one that commands it. He is the only one who can make anything holy. Attendance that is commanded, or this assembly that's commanded by God, attendance for it is not optional. You don't find any optional here. He just says it's a day of holy convocation. Because of the scattered condition of God's people today, there are some who legitimately are not able to attend, unable to convene due to either health issues, cost issues, or simply distance and reliable transportation. You know, they have a legitimate reason for not getting together to physically gather as they are commanded to do. Now, most of them do convene via electronic anymore, telephones, computers, or whatever, But again, physically gather is what God really is after here, a physical gathering. However, all who are legitimately able are required, despite the fact that some, because of legitimate circumstances, can't. Well, the rest are, if they are legitimately able to do so, they're required to attend. It's not an option. I mean, if you can find anywhere, and I've searched the Genesis to Revelation, I can't find an option on here. It's not. God is very specific every time he talks about the Sabbath. Holy convocation. Back over in Hebrews chapter 10, let's note what the Apostle Paul addresses, because this was an issue even in the first century church. Here in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23, he states, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering," or without the slightest hesitation, the Phillips translation has, "for he who promised is faithful." God is faithful. He is faithful to bless, but he's also faithful to carry out punishment for those who don't. He is faithful. And verse 24, note this one, "And let us consider one another." Sometimes we miss that point there, that there's an importance here of considering one another, not just ourselves. Okay? Consider one another in order to stir up, or as the Complete Jewish Bible has here, to spur each other on to love and good works. Not, verse 25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, that is, not attending holy convocation, as is the manner of some. So this was a problem in the first century in the church. But rather exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day, that is the end of this present age and the return of Jesus Christ, the establishment of the kingdom over all nations, the day, as you see the day approaching. The Apostle Paul stresses, as God certainly does by requiring a convocation that we are to assemble on, interaction on the Sabbath with others who have and are being led by the Spirit of God is critical. It's critical. But again, I emphasize those who are being led by, who have and are being led by the Spirit of God, because some seem to have it, but they have buried it somewhere based upon how they treat the holy time of the Sabbath. Iron sharpening iron is very important for sustaining spiritual balance, for helping each other grow in the unity of the Spirit. It's very important. Again, spiritual balance. There are people who get off the deep end because they don't have communication face-to-face with other members of the church, and they come up with some of the craziest heretical teachings. Flat earth. I want to make sure I get that one out there because I'm a heretic for what I teach. Well, the flat earthers, you're nuts. You're nuts. Unbelievable how people can think that that's important for salvation, to say whether the earth is a sphere or a flat plate that somehow looks totally different than the rest of everything the telescopes show us. But then we have people who, Christ can't be the God of the Old Testament. The Father, the Most High, is the God of the Old Testament. Give me a break. The Apostle Paul's a liar in 1 Corinthians 10:4, if that's the case. Throw out Paul's writings. No, you've got all kinds of heretics because people will not be iron sharpening iron. And if somebody is heretical, pointing it out to them. You are wrong. And how do we do this? It's because we have to get together. We need to talk. We need to iron sharpening iron. We need to be open to those who have God's Spirit, who can somehow help us see where maybe we're going off base. Anyway, it's important, this assembly. But again, it depends upon whether that assembly is an assembly where people are being led by the Spirit of God, or whether they're just party animals. Anyway, to understand why the Sabbath is different from the previous 6 days and a day of complete rest, we need to go back to its origin in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, and we'll go down here to verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image." Now here we have the Most High and the Word, that are in communication with each other about this creation of man. "Let us make him in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, cattle, over all creeping things." So, verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Notice that. Male and female he created them. Not some other harebrained, stupid idea that all kinds of weirdo people with mental illness have. Unbelievable. How in the world did we get into this insane asylum of the world today? Anyway, male and female, he created them. Now, down in verse 31, then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. The male and the female was very good. There wasn't any problem with them. They didn't need to alter their gender. Okay, that's the way God created them. So the evening and morning were the sixth day. What we find here is that man was created on the sixth day when God created the week. When he made the week, man was on day number 6. Now, let's move right on to chapter 2, verse 1. "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done. And he rested on the seventh day." This is how he ended his work. He rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. Hebrew, Kodash. What does that mean? Declare it holy, as the Tanakh translation has it. He declared it holy. He blessed the seventh day and declared it holy because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. He rested from the physical works he had performed on each of the preceding days. He established the seventh day by refraining from what he had been doing the other 6. He created the Sabbath day by not working in or within the physical realm. There was not one physical thing that he did, altered, or whatever on the seventh day. He rested from all of the physical. His example shows that a major purpose for the Sabbath is to rest from the normal work that is done through the rest of the week. It is a time when man is to cease from providing for his own physical needs, both in thought as well as in deed. He's to get his mind off of that. Get his mind off the work. Get his mind off the things of the world. And focus where it's supposed to be, as God focused on the seventh day. God provided the understanding of the Sabbath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Let's go over to Exodus chapter 16. However, after the descendants of Jacob became enslaved in Egypt, that understanding of which day was the Sabbath was lost. Once God freed the descendants of Jacob from their bondage, he impressed upon them here in Exodus chapter 16 the importance of the holy time of the Sabbath. Here in verse 1, Exodus 16, "And they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt." This is 4 weeks later. "Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, 'Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Eternal in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and when we ate bread to the full. For you,' speaking to Moses, 'you brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.' Then the Eternal said to Moses, 'Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they,'" note, "they shall prepare on the 6th day what they bring in. and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Now, we'll skip over the story of what all took place with the quail. Let's come down to verse 22. And so it was on the sixth day. On the sixth day, they began this on Sunday. On the sixth day, this is a Friday as we look at the calendar, that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, this is what the Eternal has said, tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Eternal. It is a holy Sabbath to the Eternal, not for you to do whatever you want to do. It's not a day of vacation for you. It is a Sabbath day to the Eternal. So, bake what you will bake today. Notice what he's saying here. On the sixth day, bake what you will bake today. That is what you intend to eat tomorrow. Bake it today. Boil what you will boil and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. God instructed them to use the sixth day as the time to prepare for the needs that they would have on the Sabbath. From that time forward, from the time he instituted that here in Exodus chapter 16, which was beginning with the day before the fifth Sabbath since they had left Egypt. Okay? The fifth Sabbath. Beginning on that day, they were going to have, they had to prepare on that Friday before that fifth Sabbath. And from that day forward, God continues to require his people to prepare on the sixth day, not on the seventh, on the sixth day. Back in Mark, hold your place in Exodus, but in Mark 15 and verse 42, the Complete Jewish Bible has, since it was the preparation day, that is, the day before a Shabbat. Now, this phrase, the day before a Shabbat, is translated from the Greek word pro-Sabbaton. Pro-Sabbaton. Pro, before. Okay? Before the Sabbath. The day before the Sabbath. So, since it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Shabbat, as evening approached, the evening which would end the sixth day beginning the seventh. So again, the preparation day carried on. Still does to this day. Now, back in Exodus 16 again, verse 29. Exodus 16:29. See, for the Eternal has given you the Sabbath. Notice, he's given you. This is a gift. This is a gift. Do not treat a gift with disrespect. He has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you on the sixth day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. Now, the Sabbath, again, is a gift of God, a designated period of time that he has made holy by placing his presence on that day when he rested on the seventh day as his final act of creating the time period of a week. He expects his people. He requires and therefore he expects his people to be fully prepared to rejoice over his gift by properly using every second of its holy time. That's what he is expecting. Therefore, he has appointed the sixth day to be the preparation day for the Sabbath. His people are expected to prepare on the day before the Sabbath for the needs that they anticipate for themselves on the Sabbath day. Now, God clarifies, back in Exodus chapter 20 again, he clarifies each person's personal rest requirements. Note, Exodus 20, again, verse 8, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Eternal your God. In it you shall do what? No work. That's the requirement. no work. You, or your son, your daughter, male servant, female servant, your cattle, the stranger that's within your gates. Now, those who are within your gates refer to all of the individuals as well as work animals under your direct control. You are not to force them, require them to work, no more than you yourself would work. According to the letter of the law of the Fourth Commandment, no work is allowed on the Sabbath. Yet, Jesus addressed work allowances in his teachings when he finally comes and, as the messenger of the new covenant, he shows that there's some things that we need to take into consideration about this no work. What do you mean, no work? Back in Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12. And we'll begin here in verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." They were doing what the Pharisees declared was unlawful. Not what God said was unlawful, but what the Pharisees declared was unlawful. One of the 39 prohibitions that the rabbis came up with, prohibitions for the way the Sabbath was to be treated, one of those prohibitions decreed, again, by the religious leaders, that reaping crops was not allowable. You cannot reap a crop. And therefore, if you're taking some grain off of a head of wheat or barley or whatever, you're harvesting, you're reaping. No. But that's their requirement. They were very specific about it. They considered plucking grain to satisfy hunger to be reaping. And therefore, it was unlawful. That's unlawful according to our prohibitions, not according to God, because God says you can eat on the Sabbath. And you don't have to do a whole lot of preparation if you're just going to pluck some grain off and throw it in your mouth. Okay? You don't have to cook it, or you don't have to boil it, or whatever. And so they weren't doing anything wrong, at least according to what God says, but according to the rabbis. In verse 3, "But he said to them," Jesus answered, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, or the bread of the presence," which is the complete Jewish Bible rendering, the bread of the presence. It was the bread of the presence because it was laid out in the holy place in front of the curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies before the Ark of the Covenant. This was bread in the presence of God, okay? Hence, showbread or presence bread, the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him to eat, Jesus said. It wasn't lawful for David, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Now, the priests profaned the Sabbath because they labored strenuously for hours on that day, even though the Fourth Commandment decreed that there was to be no work done. So what work did God assign them to perform during the holy time of the Sabbath? Well, let's look back in Leviticus 24, first of all. Leviticus 24, and beginning in verse 5, he says, "And you," speaking to the Levites, "you shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake. You shall set them in 2 rows, 6 in a row, on the pure gold table before the Eternal." Note, before the Eternal, in his presence, hence bread of the presence. "And you shall put pure frankincense on each row, that it may be on the bread for a memorial, an offering made by fire to the Eternal. Every Sabbath he shall set it in order before the Eternal continually." What day was the bread replaced? The Sabbath. That's what it says. "Continually, being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place. For it is most holy to him from the offerings of the eternal made by fire, by a perpetual statute. The priests, again, replaced the showbread every Sabbath after it was baked by other Levites. You know, we're told back in First Chronicles, I won't turn there, but First Chronicles 9:32 is where you will find it. First Chronicles 9:32, it says there that some of the brethren of the priests, which were Levites of the family of it was the descendants of Kohath, the Kohathites, they were the ones who were in charge of preparing the showbread. So they're the ones that took the flour and whatever and mixed it up and baked it on the Sabbath and then brought it to the priest, and the priest took it into the holy place and replaced the old bread. All right? So showbread required baking, it required removal and resetting the table before God. Now, another thing, in Numbers chapter 28, how else did the priests profane the Sabbath? That is, the no-work order. Here in Numbers chapter 28, verse 1, I'll read from the New Living Translation. It says, "The Eternal said to Moses, 'Give these instructions to the people of Israel. The offerings you present as special gifts are a pleasing aroma to me. They are my food. See to it that they are brought at the appointed times and offered according to my instructions.'" So God says, if He commands it, that's what's to be done. He commanded the showbread to be replaced every Sabbath, which means He commanded that new bread be baked. God commanded it, and you're to do whatever I tell you at the appointed times and offered according to my instructions. Verse 3, "Say to the people, this is the special gift you must present to the Eternal as your daily burnt offering. You must offer 2 one-year-old male lambs with no defects. Sacrifice 1 lamb in the morning and the other in the evening. All of this on the Sabbath. With each lamb you must offer a grain offering of 2 quarts of choice flour mixed with 1 quart of pure oil of pressed olives. This is the regular burnt offering instituted at Mount Sinai as a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Eternal. Along with it, you must present the proper liquid, or the New King James says drink offering, of 1 quart of alcoholic drink with each lamb, poured out in the holy place as an offering to the Eternal. Offer the 2nd lamb in the evening with the same grain offering and liquid offering. It too is a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Eternal. God required 2 lambs sacrificed every day, one at 9 a.m., the other at 3 p.m., both signifying the time Christ would ultimately be crucified and when He would ultimately die. That's what those offerings symbolized. Now, he goes on in verse 9. On the Sabbath day, in addition to the 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening, on the Sabbath they sacrifice 2 one-year-old male lambs with no defects. They must be accompanied by a grain offering of 4 quarts of choice flour moistened with olive oil and a liquid offering. This is the burnt offering to be presented each Sabbath, note, in addition to the regular burnt offering, the 2 lambs, and its accompanying liquid offering. So even more work was required on the Sabbath. Special offerings in addition to the ones that were made every day. Then in verse 11, on the first day of each month, present an extra burnt offering to the Eternal of 2 young bulls, now we're getting the larger animals, 1 ram, and 7 one-year-old male lambs, all with no defects. Now, yes, first day of each month. You will find, if you look through the years, virtually every year, every Hebrew year has at least 2 Sabbaths that fall on the new moon. So, on the new moon, well, you've got to do all the extra. And this is a lot of work. Hence, Jesus said, they profane the Sabbath, but they're doing it because God instructs them. They're simply profaning the no work because God has superseded that by saying, no, this you've got to do to point the people to me and to point the people ultimately to the sacrifice that will make possible their entry into the real rest, the rest of the kingdom of God. When we finally cease being in the flesh and move into the realm of spirit, there's no physical work then, nothing physical to do. Now, in addition to the work done by the priests, Jesus also pointed to another example of an exception to the letter of the law regarding how David received the showbread to satisfy the hunger of his men. So let's go to 1 Samuel now, chapter 21. 1 Samuel 21 and verse 1 says, Now David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. So skip down to verse 3. We won't go through that next information there. But verse 3. Now, therefore, David is telling Ahimelech, What have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found. And the priest answered David and said, There's no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. Verse 5 from the Complete Jewish Bible, David answered the Cohen, that is the priest, as other translations would have, Of course women have been kept away from us, as on previous campaigns. Whenever I go out on campaign, the men's gear is clean, even if it's an ordinary trip. How much more then today when they will be putting something consecrated in their packs? This is translated a little bit differently than the King James. Verse 6, So the priest gave him holy bread. What's the holy bread? It's the showbread. Only bread that's holy. Priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, the bread of the presence, which had been taken from before the eternal in order to put hot bread in its place. Note, hot bread, to put hot bread. This is freshly baked bread that was done on the Sabbath in its place on the day when it was taken away. So the priest says, I've got the stuff from last week, because we've already replaced the showbread, on the Sabbath, and now all we have is the stuff from last week, but it's got to be eaten in a holy place, obviously. The letter of the law decreed that the showbread was most holy. We just read that. But only for the descendants of Aaron, and yet David was allowed to eat it. Why? Because he and his men were very, very hungry. They had a need. And so God said, okay, even though the showbread is only for Aaron and his family, if they determine that someone is in need, they can use that to satisfy the need of the individual that's hungry. That's the way Ahimelech understood it, and that's what happened. Now, Jesus summarized the principle that he used in the parallel account back in Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2 and verse 27. And he said to them, he spoke to the rabbis, the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Well, we saw man was made on the 6th day. The Sabbath was made when? On the 7th day. So the Sabbath came after man. Man preceded the Sabbath. So the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made to benefit man. It was to benefit man. Man was not made to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made to serve man. However, the Sabbath provides time for man to serve and worship God. That's its purpose. The Jews treated the Sabbath as if it was created before man, and man was therefore a servant or a slave to the time of the 7th day of the Sabbath. But here in Mark 2:27, Jesus reminds us that the Sabbath was created after man, for man, to serve the needs of man, specifically the spiritual needs, but rest, physical rest also. The relationship of the Sabbath to mankind is similar to that of woman to man. Woman was made after man. Just go back to Genesis chapter 2 and you'll find that out. Woman was made after the man for man. Clearly we understand that just because the woman was made for man does not give man the right to abuse the woman. Does not give him the right. Neither does mankind have the right to abuse the Sabbath. Same principle. Now, Jesus did not dispute what the Fourth Commandment said. He doesn't say, oh, we've always taken the Fourth Commandment a little too strictly. That's not what he said. By these examples that he gives of what the priest did, what happened with David and the showbread. No, he did not dispute that the Sabbath is to be kept holy. No work is to be done on it. But he did illustrate two exceptions to show that the Jews' reasoning was warped, the way they kept the Sabbath. We got no reaping, no winnowing, no sowing, down to people were afraid to move on the Sabbath because of all these restrictions that they came up with. And God didn't want that. God didn't want that, and Jesus is pointing that out to show where these rabbis, where these religious leaders had gotten people off base. The Sabbath, again, was created to serve the needs of man, to give him a break from his normal labor, both physically and mentally, and to sustain his contact with God, to have more time to spend with God on that day than the work week when he's got to get out here and make a living. Jesus did not begin here to legislate when grain could be plucked and when it couldn't, nor the limit of how much grain could be plucked, nor whether a person even had to eat if he was hungry. He does not say, if you're hungry, you got to eat. He doesn't say that. That's not what he says. He did not compose a Talmud for his disciples. In fact, he was showing that this idea that the rabbis had was not good. He acknowledged that the Fourth Commandment was strict, and then he showed that God, in Scripture, God himself offered an exception to the strictness of the letter of the law when there was a legitimate need. In the case of hunger by David and his men, there's an exception. He pointed out that the commandment was made for man, and as such, the needs of man, again, hunger, for instance, superseded the strictness of the letter, which is no work. He never stated that the letter of the law, no work, could be broken in order to serve one's wants. He never said that. But needs, legitimate needs, can be taken care of. Neither did he decide for his disciples what their needs were. He didn't do that. He gave them no restrictions one way or the other. He left it to them individually. They watched his example, what he did on the Sabbath, and therefore they learned from his example. They learned from his teaching the various principles, but again, he did not decide for them. He gave them no restrictions. He left them to individually decide what their needs were. They had to make that choice. They have to learn to use their minds of how to incorporate it and perform the will of God. That's the reason he didn't tell her, you got to do this, you got to do that. He leaves it up to us today to decide what our needs are individually during the time that he's made holy for us. For example, some people have very young children to consider. The rest of us don't. So there's going to be a difference in what is done by people with young children. There are those who have health issues that others don't have. And so they have different decisions they have to make. And then some have unconverted mates, and they have to deal with those situations. People are, God's people are in different boats, if you will, and they all have to learn individually how to best keep time holy in their circumstances. Now, during his ministry, let's go over to John chapter 5. During his ministry as a mortal, Jesus set an example of appropriate Sabbath conduct or disciplines, if you will. Here in John 5 and beginning in verse 1, it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. And of course, we know the story. There's the sick people that were there, lame, blind, and so on. They were waiting for the water to stir or move, and whoever got in first, was healed. Well, we come down to verse 5. Now, there was a certain man who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed." Goodspeed says, pick up your mat, which is much better. Just a little roll-up deal that, he could lay on so he wasn't have to lay on hot pavement there. All right, so pick up your mat and walk. And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. And that day was a Sabbath. No definite article in the Greek. The New Revised Standard has it correctly. It was a Sabbath. Okay, so this was a Sabbath. This was holy time. That day was a Sabbath. Now, going on in verse 10, the Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful or permissible for you to carry your bed or carry your mat." Now, again, the lawful here is according to their regulations. That was the lawful, not according to what God says. I mean, God just told the man, pick up your bed and walk. No. So he answered them, "He who made me well said to me, take up your bed or pick up your mat and walk." Then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, or as the New International says, Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Verse 14, afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you or happen to you." Sin no more. Well, had it been a sin for him to pick up his bed and walk, he would have sinned. Jesus obviously was not telling him to sin. And so picking up your bed and walk was not a sin. This was not, a memory foam 400-pound mattress. This was just a little roll-up thing that he carried there to lay on, So again, we need to understand. Verse 15, the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father has been working until now, and I have been working." Therefore, the Jews sought all the more to kill him because he not only broke the Sabbath. No, he did not break the Sabbath. He broke their regulation that prohibited healing on the Sabbath. He not only broke the Sabbath or their regulation, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So people say, well, Jesus broke the Sabbath. No, he didn't break the Sabbath. He broke the regulation that these people, these rabbis, had stipulated. During his final Feast of Tabernacles, as a mortal, Jesus, let's go over here to chapter 7. Jesus confronted the religious leaders for the hypocrisy that they displayed when condemning him for healing a man on the Sabbath. This he brings up again here. In chapter 7, verse 21, Jesus answered and said to them, "I did one work," speaking of healing the man at the pool at Bethesda, "and you all marvel. Moses, therefore, gave you circumcision. Not that it is from Moses, it didn't originate with him, but from the fathers or the patriarchs. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath." Moses recorded the institution of circumcision when he wrote the book of Genesis. He included the story with Abraham and what God told him to do, the sign of the covenant, circumcision and so on. Since the Sabbath was created long before circumcision was performed, then its observance, the Sabbath observance, should take precedence over the time when circumcision was to be performed on the 8th day. Yet, if the 8th day fell on a Sabbath, because when you go back and read what it says there in the book of Genesis, Abraham was told, your descendants on the 8th day, no exceptions, didn't say there's an, except for the Sabbath, skip a day. Nope, it's on the 8th day, that's when it has to be done. And so if it fell on the Sabbath, the male child was circumcised in accordance with the covenant that God made with Abraham. Now, in verse 23, he goes on, if a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses, that is what's written in the law of Moses, the sign to Abraham, should not be broken. Are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? Are you people who do the circumcision, you're mad at me? See, Jesus did not condemn the practice of performing a circumcision on the 8th day, if it was a Sabbath, but rather he drew attention to the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. The rabbis had declared one of their stipulations, you cannot carry tools on the Sabbath. That's breaking the Sabbath. You carry a tool, you're breaking, knife, screwdriver, hammer, whatever, sickle, that's a tool. You can't carry a tool or you have blasphemed the Sabbath. So, again, that's what they said. You cannot carry it on the Sabbath, which means performing a circumcision would be unlawful. If carrying a tool is breaking the Sabbath, it would be unlawful to do a circumcision because tools are required. You got to cut something. You got to have a knife. You got to have a tool in order to get this accomplished. So because the law of Moses required circumcision on the 8th day, they made an exception to their regulation. Well, it's okay to carry a knife. It's okay to carry the tool to perform the circumcision on the Sabbath. But that's the exception. It has to be for a circumcision. Okay? So they got, rather than condemning themselves, they made a, law of Moses says we got to do the circumcision on the 8th day. Therefore, by condemning him for breaking their Sabbath prohibition against healing, when he healed a man without the use of any tools, Jesus didn't wave a wand or, whatever. He had nothing in his hands when he healed a man. He performed a healing without tools, and they, by what they did with circumcision, proved themselves even more guilty of profaning their prohibition than he, because their use of tools and his non-use of tools. Anyway, that's what he was doing here in John 7. Now, healing the man who had suffered from a disability for 38 years was not the only time Jesus healed on the Sabbath. Let's go back to Luke chapter 13. Luke 13 and verse 10. Luke 13, verse 10. It says, now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity, or the New Revised Standard, had a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years, and was bent over, and could no way raise herself up. But when Jesus saw her, he called her to him, and he said to her, woman, you are loosed from your infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, or the New Revised Standard, she stood up straight and glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, and he said to the crowd, there are 6 days on which men ought to work. Therefore, come and be healed on them and not on the Sabbath day. Ooh, the ruler of the synagogue, top rabbi there, made this declaration. Now, verse 15, the Lord then answered him and said, hypocrite. Notice he called things the way they were. You hypocrite. Does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it away to water it? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, think of it, for 18 years be loosed from this bond or this bondage on the Sabbath? And when he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, And all the multitude, or the complete Jewish Bible has, but the rest of the crowd rejoiced for all the wonderful things that were done by him. Jesus showed that fulfilling the needs of a human being who was suffering, fulfilling their needs on the Sabbath is more important than taking care of animals, which should be a no-brainer. Now, another example, let's go back to Matthew chapter 12. This example occurred shortly after the disciples were condemned by the religious leaders for plucking grain on the Sabbath. So in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 10, "And behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. Then he said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit or into a hole on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of course, they would lift it out. Of how much more value, verse 12, then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." That's the point he's making here. It is lawful to do good. Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand," and he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. It is within the spirit of the Fourth Commandment to do good, but what's the context? To do good by showing compassion on those who are suffering. That's all he did here. Showing compassion on those who are suffering. That's the doing good. Doing good on the Sabbath does not include assisting others to accomplish work that they are performing, such as installing appliances. Neighbor calls, "I need some help getting this dishwasher in." Or, "Can you help me put up my fence?" You know, I mean, there are all kinds of things. You know, hauling trash to the dump. "Well, I can put on a sermon tape and listen to it while I'm doing this." Don't use that excuse. There are people who do this crazy things. "Well, you know, I can do whatever I want to as long as I get a little Bible study in somewhere. Or as long as I listen to a taped sermon, and I'm okay with God." Pooh. I think I'd reconsider that point of view based upon what's at stake. Eternal life is at stake here. This is a serious situation, brethren. In Luke 14, let's go back to Luke again, 14. Verse 1. "Now it happened, as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy," or as the complete Jewish Bible, I think, brings out more clearly, there was a man before him whose body was swollen with fluids. A lot of fluid retention this individual was suffering. And Jesus asked the lawyers or the scribes and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" You know, they had asked him this before. Now he's asking the question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But they kept silent. They were afraid to say anything because they knew better. They would always be put in their place when they tried to argue with him. And he took him and healed him and sent him away, the New Revised Standard says. Then, verse 5, he said to them, he answered them, saying, "Which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day?" Now, none of them, not a one of them, would ever refrain from helping an animal in severe distress because the law required them to do so. You know, I won't turn there, but back in Deuteronomy 22, verse 4, is where God says, he doesn't say, if you see your neighbor's donkey or his ox fall into a pit, then you got to help him. Got to help him get him out of the pit. Because that animal's going to thrash around and possibly kill itself. Certainly break its legs. So yes, show compassion. Show some compassion for this animal and help your neighbor get him out of the ditch. Now, people have used this, this is ox in the ditch, we didn't get the work done this week, and therefore, they want us to come in and work a couple hours on Saturday afternoon, and, well, that's an ox in the ditch because we got to have this done, or some people are going to be out of jobs. Sorry, this is not an ox in the ditch. Ox in the ditch involves a life-threatening situation. This is a life-threatening situation for this animal. And so don't use this ox in the ditch stuff for crazy, far-out thing. Well, I want to do this, so therefore it's an ox in the ditch. No. Again, this is serious stuff. It's serious stuff. God allowed his people to work on the Sabbath in order to save an animal's life. But he did require men to be put to death, to have them put to death for expending less physical labor to fulfill their personal desires than they would have expended in getting an ox out of a ditch. Exodus chapter 35, note. Exodus 35, verse 2. 6 days, or work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh day shall be a holy day for you, a Sabbath of rest to the eternal. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. Notice that? Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire throughout your dwellings on the Sabbath day. And he's talking here about doing something in order to do work. If you're cold, you can build a fire on the Sabbath. Yes, you can open your refrigerator to get something out, and if the light bulb comes on, and if fire is kindled so you can see inside, that's okay. Now, for Orthodox Jews, no, that's not okay. You either unscrew the bulb so that when you open the door, the light doesn't come on, or you've kindled a fire. He's talking here about a fire that is substantial for doing work. Now, despite God's pronounced death sentence on those who ignored the sanctity of holy time, there were people who reasoned that they were exempt and paid the full price. For instance, I won't go back, but there's an example in Numbers chapter 15 of a man who went out and he was gathering wood on the Sabbath day. And so the people brought him in and they consulted God. God just put him to death. He disobeyed me. He's doing work. He's not doing what I created this holy time to be done on this holy time. He's not doing it. Let's put him to death. As we've seen from Christ's examples, work is not an absolute prohibition on the Sabbath day. But any work done is to be weighed against the need for that work. The need. When a man has an urgent need for his welfare while keeping the Sabbath as a day of rest, there may be certain things that he should do on the Sabbath that would be considered work, but would be legitimate exceptions based on the biblical examples. The Sabbath was never made by God to be so rigid as to make it impossible to be observed. That's what the Jews were doing when Jesus came on the scene. They were making the Sabbath virtually impossible to keep with all the regulations that they added to what you could or couldn't do on the Sabbath. Every example of Jesus concerning the Sabbath deals with its intent and its purpose, not on all of the things that are forbidden to do. He stressed that the Sabbath was made for man. That is a day to be used to focus on physical rest from our normal work and on mental rest from distractions of this present evil world that constantly bombard us. We're to get away from this world. If we want to really make the use of the time that God has made holy, then we don't need to be, tuning in to the news, to sports, to constant cell phone interruptions, wasting our time. because it is a waste of time. You got 6 days out of the week. There's always enough news to make you mad every day of the week. You know? And there's always something. Sometimes multiple things. It's a day to focus on the greatness of the Creator God and on the ultimate fulfillment of His plan. The rest, again, the rest from all of the physical labor when we are no longer physical. After we receive eternal life and enter into the realm of spirit. That's the ultimate rest. You know, the Apostle Paul shows how all of this relates, the Sabbath relates to the ultimate rest there in Hebrews chapter 4. That's the rest. And we need, on this day of rest, we need to be thinking about that ultimate end, what it's all about, eternal life, becoming a child of God, a member of the family of God, living forever and ever and ever. We are to prepare for the needs of the Sabbath day on the day before. Again, it's very clear, on the day before. But if certain needs arise unexpectedly on the day, whether it be hunger, like it did with the disciples who were out walking, need to care for property, car breaks down on the way to or from services, we need to do something with the car, need to change flat, something needs to be done, need to do good for someone who may be sick and needs somebody to come over and help take care of whatever needs, they're throwing up and they need some help. They have nobody else to turn to. Sometimes we need warmth if it's too cold. We need to cool down if it's too hot. There are things, and these things are certainly allowable. We're allowed to take care of those kinds of needs. However, we must also be careful not to rationalize our wants as being needs. Needs are not wants. Let's go back to Isaiah chapter 58. Isaiah 58 and verse 13. Isaiah 58:13. I'll read from the Tanakh translation first of all. If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, if you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your affairs, or as the New King James, doing your pleasure. The Hebrew word here is chafats, or chafats. It means desires. Your desires. Doing your desires on my holy day. If you call the Sabbath delight, the eternal's holy day honored. And if you honor it, or as the King James says, Him, if you honor God by doing what He tells you to do on that time, and go not your ways, nor look to your affairs, nor strike bargains, and he goes on to say, I'll bless you. But let's look at verse 13 from the New English translation. It says, you must observe the Sabbath rather than doing anything you please on my holy day. You must look forward to the Sabbath and treat the eternal's holy day with respect. You must treat it with respect by refraining from your normal activities and by refraining from your selfish pursuits. Again, chafets or chafets. Your desires, from your selfish desires, refraining from your selfish desires and from making business deals. Again, we are not allowed to take care of our wants. We're allowed to take care of our needs. Less than 300 years after this warning was recorded, go over to Nehemiah chapter 13. It was recorded by Isaiah. The descendants of the Jews who had returned from exile in Babylon failed to heed this warning. The Sabbath was no longer treated with respect. People were doing whatever they desired. Here in verse 15, I'll read from the New Living Translation. In those days, I saw men of Judah treading out their wine presses. Treading out their wine presses on the Sabbath? They were also bringing in grain, loading it on donkeys and bringing their wine, grapes, figs, and all sorts of produce to Jerusalem to sell on the Sabbath. So I rebuked them for selling their produce on that day. Some men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise. They were selling it on the Sabbath to the people of Judah, to the Jews who knew what the Sabbath was. And in Jerusalem at that, in the very city where the temple of God stood. So I confronted the nobles of Judah. Why are you profaning the Sabbath in this evil way, I asked. Wasn't it just this sort of thing that your ancestors did that caused our God to bring all this trouble upon us in our city? Now you are bringing even more wrath upon Israel by permitting the Sabbath to be desecrated in this way. Then I commanded that the gates of Jerusalem should be shut as darkness fell every Friday evening, not to be opened till the Sabbath ended. I sent some of my own servants to guard the gates so that no merchandise could be brought in on the Sabbath day. The merchants and tradesmen with a variety of wares camped outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I spoke sharply to them and said, "What are you doing out here, camping around the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you." And that was the last time they came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and to guard the gates in order to preserve the holiness of the Sabbath. Remember this good deed also, O my God. Have compassion on me according to your great and unfailing love. This example, along with some of the other things that we've seen earlier, shows what happens when people see just how far they can go in doing things that the letter of the law forbids, but which the spirit of the law might allow them as an exception. I mean, look how far they went here in Nehemiah 13. They went bananas. They trampled the Sabbath underfoot. We must not be like those who see how far they can go on the Sabbath, who ask, how much freedom can I have? How much freedom from doing, Bible study and assembling together and, how many things can I do? What will they be allowed to do? What will I be allowed to do? How close can I get to getting my wants on the Sabbath? Rather, whenever we have a question about whether an activity would be appropriate for the Sabbath, we need to ask ourselves, is it really necessary? Is it really necessary? Is it a genuine need? Would God say it's a need? Is it a genuine need? Would it help to better fulfill the purpose of the Sabbath to do this? Will it help to draw closer to God if I do what I would like to do? Is it spiritually motivated? Most importantly, is it spiritually motivated? Or is it a temptation to fulfill a selfish desire? Because temptations, we're always being tempted. Where is this idea that can I do this? Where's it coming from? Certainly it's not coming from God. And the tempter, as we covered last time, is all around. I'm aware of individuals in various church groups who regularly spend holy time in front of a TV or computer monitor watching regular programming, sports, movies, whatever they want to do, rather than devoting their attention to the study of the Word of God. Like, I can't get enough TV in 6 days. I got to have a little bit more on the Sabbath. And I just love to be in front of that computer and watch all of these things that are happening, and I just love to do, and I can't get enough of it on 6 days. I need it on the seventh day too. What? 6 days you shall work. 6 days you fulfill your desires, your wants. The seventh day is a Sabbath to the eternal, not to you. You are to show respect to the eternal on that day. Now, there are others who plan vacation travel that I've heard about, unbelievably, on planes, on ships, that vacation either begins or it ends on the Sabbath, which is very difficult to justify based on the amount of time that's required for processing passengers and their luggage, whether at airports or cruise terminals. It takes a lot of time. I've never been on a cruise on the Sabbath. I've left on a Friday, and I've kept the Sabbath on a cruise ship before. But, to actually spend, it takes hours. to board. It takes hours. What are you doing?
Well, I'm going to listen to a sermon on my MP3 player while I'm waiting in the, in the lounge here before they let me board the boat.
Others don't take a second thought about attending school functions, class reunions, any number of social events on holy time with the unconverted. Even though we are not to forsake the assembly of ourselves, meaning the converted members of the body of Christ, not those in the world. We got 6 days for that. 6 days, 6 out of 7. God says, I give you 6 days. I just want you to respect the 7th. Each one of us, brethren, must give account to God for how we personally use holy time. We must never allow any activity to take our focus away from the spiritual reasons for which God has given us the Sabbath. We must never forget that the penalty for transgressing the holy time of the Sabbath is the same as putting other gods before God. Idolatry, murder, adultery, stealing, lying, and so forth and so on. The penalty is death. It's death. Does that sink in? You're no better than a murderer if you're out here trampling over the holy time of God's Sabbath. That's scary. That's scary. The way we treat holy time is an extremely serious matter. And it's gotten to be where it's not so serious for a lot of God's people. This world is just tearing at them. It's taken away their spirituality. Remember, Jesus never endorsed a Talmud for his disciples regarding what is or is not allowed on the Sabbath. However, he has given us his Spirit to guide us in keeping the Fourth Commandment. If we're not convicted by his Spirit that our intended use of holy time is correct, then we should not do it. Because we are told, back in Romans chapter 14, verse 23, that any action that is not based on the conviction provided by faith is sin. It's sin. If the conviction of the Holy Spirit is, no, I don't feel right, don't do it. That's what it means. All that we do on holy time must be in accordance with the spirit of the Fourth Commandment. Guided by the Spirit of God, we must use the examples from both the Old as well as the New Testaments and the law to determine whether there is or is not a legitimate need that exists and can be allowed on holy time. Hopefully, brethren, this basic reminder of the importance of the Fourth Commandment, of the need to rest physically from our normal work and to rest mentally from the continual bombardment or of the distractions of this present evil world, and to wholeheartedly focus on the greatness of the Creator God will help us to be much more mindful of what we think and do on the day that God has made and gifted to us, and that from now forward we are very careful to fulfill Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy.